Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today for this seminar looking at the implications of xenophobia for South Africa's trade and transformation. It's really an opportunity to think more broadly about the implications of xenophobia, xenophobic violence, discrimination for South Africa's trajectory and its ability to address the very real social issues, the strong inequality, the insecurity, the other challenges that we all know are facing South Africa. Today's event is part of the university centenary series that's celebrating 100 years of Wits University. Last week, they presented a distinctive and from what I understand, very enchanting performance by William Kentridge called "Oh, to Believe in Another World." This week's offering, I think, is perhaps less anticipated. It's also free. That one costs 600 Rand. But I think we can take inspiration from the title of that. And part of what the university has always done is help us imagine a different world and help us to think about ways of addressing the challenges that are before us, whether that, in the case of his work, was rising authoritarianism in what became the Soviet Union, or the challenges that we're facing today. Indeed, I think there's really no better time to think about the role of a university, the role of critical scholarship, the role of independent voice in a society such as ours. Yesterday, we learned that colleagues from the Socioeconomic Rights Institute, based just down the road, many of whom were formerly at WITS and who it's sort of a spin-off from WITS, that these colleagues who have dedicated themselves to fighting for the rights of the dispossessed, the homeless, people disenfranchised in many different ways, are now being threatened, presumably by people in government or allied with government, because of the work that they're doing, because of they're standing up for human rights. And while I hope that there are no such threats today against any of our panelists, I think we all have to recognize the importance of being able to speak freely about issues that are affecting us, even when those issues are unpopular, even when they speak out against many in the status quo. And it is precisely that sort of spirit that gave birth, or part of what gave birth to XenoWatch 6 years ago. XenoWatch being a kind of host here at ACMS. It is a platform designed to monitor violence against foreigners, against immigrants, against others who are outside of the communities where they're living. And for the last 5 or 6 years, XenoWatch has carefully monitored attacks, threats, mobilizations against outsiders around the country. It has published that information. And today we're celebrating, if that's the word, the publication of a sort of 5-year report. As we know, xenophobia, violence, communal violence has been a hallmark of South Africa for many years. I think it has become even more so, and drawing from one of the reports from one of our colleagues here on the panel today, we see that the crime statistics have shown an upward trajectory, not a downward trajectory as we'd hope, for violent crime in 2021 and 2022. Factors behind that have been factors that have plagued us for years: inequality, poverty, but also a declining trust in government, in officials, in the ability of people to make promises that will be believed. These things have gotten worse. They have been exacerbated undoubtedly, by the economic crisis associated with the COVID pandemic, the shutdowns, the challenges that's brought to trade, to economic prosperity, to growth, and now more recently with the rising unemployment the rising cost of food, of fuel, and the kind of hardship that has put on many people. As a result of all of these factors, we live in South Africa in one of the most dangerous peacetime societies in the world. This manifests itself in multiple forms, across multiple scales. Many of us will know about sort of gender-based violence, racism, petty theft. We hear recently about violence in taverns against people simply sitting there and drinking. More and more about kidnappings and property damage. Of course, there's also crimes that we don't see every day right in front of us. Corruption in the tendering process, corporate kickbacks, various forms of extortion, threats, patronage that have left many of us angry and despondent, and many South Africans far poorer than they should be. Right? For those of you who follow South African politics or live here, right, this is this kind of insecurity is nothing new. It's something that we all confront. But those who confront it most acutely are those who are already most disadvantaged. People living in informal settlements, immigrants, people living in townships, in the inner city. Those who are already poor, I think, are feeling the effects of this most, whether it's direct attacks on them, directs on their community, or the threats to their future that come from officials and others who are stealing, who are facing, who are not managing these spaces properly. And in this way, xenophobic violence is no exception. It too faces and confronts people who are already vulnerable, neighbors from other countries, but most importantly, even South Africans who have moved to new communities, who are not fully accepted as local enough because they speak the wrong language, they are associated with the wrong political group, or for some reason, they're simply not in line with the politics of the place. There are many reasons for this, which Jean-Pierre will explore, I think, in a few minutes' time. And there are also reasons why these kind of issues have become so intractable, why we see the government so unwilling to even mention that xenophobia exists, why we see interventions over time since 2008, since the first big widespread attacks, which seem so ineffective. And I think we need to think about what it is that we're doing right and what it is that we're doing wrong to address these issues. And one of the things that we're clearly not getting right is finding a way of preventing what was once a fringe movement of anti-immigrant groups from moving to the political mainstream. Not just the Operation Dudulas that we have seen and many of us fear, but one party, one political movement after another, racing to the call to close the borders, to protect the labor market. What was once at the edge of South African politics is now at the mainstream, at the heart of South African politics. And we need to ask ourselves, how did that happen? And we need to ask ourselves, what are the implications of that? So today what we're doing is trying to have a conversation that is not only about the direct victims of the crime, not only about the Zimbabweans, the Pakistanis, the Malawians, or any others who have been chased from their homes, who may have been killed, the people who've lost their livelihoods when a market or a shop is burnt or looted. We're not just talking about the truck drivers who've been attacked, but rather what are the implications of these attacks? What does this mean for governance? What does this mean for investment? What does this mean for South Africa's ability to address the very real, very acute and lingering challenges that it faces? And to do this, we've assembled three eminent speakers. Most of you here, at least, will already know them, but allow me a few minutes to introduce them before I turn over to them. We'll first hear from my colleague here at WITS, Jean-Pierre Messago. Those of you who follow xenophobia and migration in South Africa will already know him well. For those who don't, he's a senior researcher with the African Center for Migration and Society at WITS University. He's a BSc in psychology from the University of Zimbabwe. He did his master's with us here in forced migration studies, then went off to do another master's at Tufts University in humanitarian assistance and a PhD here. Most importantly, he is one of the co-founders of XenoWatch and has worked on issues of communal violence, conflict, and xenophobic violence for the last, let's say, 10 or 15 years. Our second panelist, sitting next to Jean-Pierre, Siphelele Ngobisi. Yes, sorry if I get that wrong. Senior researcher in the South African Cities Network. And translates intelligence to action for South Africa's largest metros. Her focus, appropriately enough, is inclusion, well-being, and the developmental city. Among other interventions to seed better municipal practice, she coordinates peer-to-peer learning platforms such as the Urban Safety Reference Group that primarily engage city practitioners and officials. For those who haven't seen it, I would also recommend that you have a look at the State of Urban Safety Report, which I think has come up fairly recently, is now an annual publication, which for which you are, I don't know if it's the lead author, the coordinator, the convener, but certainly a prominent role in that report. Our final panelist sitting next to me is Mavuso Msimang. I first encountered him when he was the Director General of the Department of Home Affairs. That's how I first got to know you, but it's one of your, I don't know if it's one of your lesser roles, but one of the many roles that he has achieved and positions he's held. These go back to working with the MK in exile in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s, positions in this with South African Parks, membership in the ANC's National Executive Committee, and chair also of the board of Corruption Watch, from which he's recently stepped down. Continues working in many different capacities and has become an increasingly vocal and principled critic and commentator on the current state of South African politics, raising questions about the party, about its ability to lead and the direction that South Africa is going. So we're going to hear from each of them in turn. I've asked them to offer a sort of brief input onto the question that we're sort of framing with, and then we'll come back with some follow-up questions as a kind of conversation. For those of you here in the room, please feel free at any time once we've gone through that first round to raise your hands to ask questions. For those online, we can't see, well, I hope soon, one of us can see the questions that you're raising through the Q&A section. In the interest of keeping the conversation flowing, we won't be coming to you directly online, but we'll try to address the questions that you're posing through that mechanism. I can already see a few from anonymous and an attendee and Karabo also presenting. So we will come back to you as time allows. But let me first turn over then to Jean-Pierre to speak briefly about the new report and some of the emerging trends, if you want to call them that, in xenophobia in the country. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. Good afternoon, everyone. I only have 30 minutes, so I will go straight into it. As Lauren just mentioned, ACMS has been doing research on xenophobic violence for more than 10 years now. And currently, our research is conducted under the Xenowatch project. It just describes Xenowatch as a platform that monitors xenophobic discrimination, focusing on violence in the country. Its main aim is to contribute to efforts towards addressing identity-based discrimination in the country. Migrants are not the only ones facing discrimination. There are other groups minority groups that face discrimination. So our efforts to contribute towards efforts to address that. So by looking at the dynamics beyond common assumptions and hypotheses, our research has provided what we believe is a more accurate understanding of xenophobic violence in terms of its drivers, responses and interventions, but also implications. The report you have, some of you have copies here and others you have online, I can actually post the link, summarizes our research or analysis over these years. So in the next 2 minutes, I'm going to go quickly through a few highlights of our analysis, our research, our report, and you can find details in the report, but also in other publications that are available online. So what do we know about xenophobic violence in terms of nature and trends? Our report details, gives a detailed account of the nature, how it manifests in different ways, and the stats or geographic spread. You will see the stats in the report, but also can see the numbers, the figures on the Xenowatch platform. This report was published at the end of last year, so the numbers are outdated. So the update figures are available now as we speak online. The Xenophobic platform also gives you, as the user, the tools to do your own analysis. You can check the time with the geographic spread, just to do your analysis of xenophobic trends analysis online. Quickly, what are the drivers or the causal factors of xenophobic violence? Our research reveals that the violence is not just caused by one factor or one issue. Yeah, it is caused by a complex interplay between underlying causes, proximate causes, and triggers. Underlying causes include the issues of poverty, unemployment, history of the past, apartheid, all those issues that are common across the country. They can therefore not really help us explain why violence happens in certain places and not in others. Proximate causes include the deficit in governance, particularly local governance, and what we call violence entrepreneurship. The triggers are embedded in mobilization, which takes different forms. But our research reveals that in general, the deficit in governance, particularly deficit in local governance and the community leadership, is the main driver of xenophobic violence. And that's why, from our point of view, research point of view, we see xenophobic violence as essentially a governance issue. Violence tends to happen, or usually happens, in areas where local governance is absent, weak, or complicit. Weak local governance is manifested by a lack of trusted leadership and lack of effective conflict resolution mechanisms. Where governance is weak, it creates leadership vacuums. And these lead to the emergence of violent, informal leadership groups that are responsible for organizing and instigating the violence for their own economic and political interest. So that's where we see deficit in governance. Governance not able to provide services to communities in terms of, socioeconomic services, but also conflict resolution, security, crime fighting, but also allowing these other groups to emerge and actually take over the authority of the state and become untouchable groups that organize violence whenever they see fit for their own benefits. Quickly on responses and interventions, again, you will see the details in the reports and the other publications that are available online. We all know from the state and its agencies that despite the recently launched the National Action Plan, the general response has been characterized by denialism and lack of political will. And that denialism, that lack of political will has led to impunity of the perpetrators, which means they can strike again whenever they see fit, as they have always done. Civil society, since 2008, have been efforts by many organizations at different levels to address the violence and, or at least mitigate its effect. But to be honest, they haven't necessarily been successful in preventing violence or even in changing the attitudes towards outsiders. If anything, you can see that kids, as already said, are going mainstream, and the violence hasn't stopped. As you will see in the stats I referred to at the beginning, violence continues to happen, is a regular occurrence. It hasn't stopped in 2008, and it happens almost every day, even though it doesn't make the news headlines. So civil society generally lacks the necessary political muscle to hold the government accountable for its failure to actually perform its main function, which is protection, safety. And as a group, as a sector, we haven't been able to hold the government accountable to do that. And that says we don't have the political influence, we don't have the political muscle required to do that. The second issue around civil society organizations and our interventions is that it doesn't seem to address the drivers of the violence. Our focus has been on awareness campaigns, education, but when you look at the drivers I just mentioned a few moments ago briefly, none of our intervention is tackling that. No interventions targeting or trying to resolve governance issues when we know it's the main driver of the violence. None of the intervention is targeting violent entrepreneurs who are the ones organize the violence for their own political, economic interest. So again, details are available in the report. For those who are interested, you can have questions later on. Quickly, others are going to comment more on implications, but from our side, it's very clear that the implications of xenophobic violence go far beyond the targeted outsiders. At the community level, it's obvious. Every time there is violence, there are always South African lives lost, almost all the time. And the property damaged, I would say 99% belongs to South Africans. So those who claim to organize violence for the interest of the community are misleading us. You cannot be protected community and then destroy their property and reach their. But generally speaking, though, xenophobic violence not only exposes the crisis of governance and rule of law, but also, perhaps more importantly, it further undermines what is left of these processes. And buying so becomes a threat to everyone. We should all be concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. I'm not going to say that was an uplifting presentation, but I think an insightful one for sure. I mean, and as we turn over to Sipilele, you know, I think there's a few things to keep in mind in what you've said. I mean, one is the deeply and highly spatialized nature of it, which clearly intersects with questions of urban governance, peri-urban governance, township governance, and also to recognize that while many of the interventions have focused on sort of public attitudes and tolerance at that individual level, we do need to see this as a fundamentally governance issue, as one of who is controlling the spaces where, if not the majority, millions of South Africans live. Who controls these spaces? To whom are they accountable? How do we engage? Right? And these questions of impunity, the questions of governance, the question of who is promoting and who is able to promote a sort of society that is more inclusive and more effective at delivering services is something that I think affects all of us. But before I get away with myself, let me turn it over to Sipilele, who knows far more about cities and urban governance than probably anyone else on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, Lauren. And I think maybe just to congratulate you on the launch of the report, which already is saying so much that is insightful and so much that is critical to really understanding the issue and its manifestations. And so when I was just listening to my colleague here presenting some of the findings, I got to thinking about just public violence in general and xenophobic violence more specifically, and just the nature of reporting that we get in the public domain, one wouldn't be blamed for thinking, in a lot of ways, it comes across as just a traffic advisory most of the time. And so it's great to have knowledge and research that has been produced, such as this report, that really drills down and begins to give us some of the more granular detail as to what is happening and how it's manifesting. And I particularly like and agree with the clarion call that says that this is a revelation or an exposure of a crisis of governance. And I would say from our own perspective, there might be some alignment between the types of research that we are respectively doing. And so I find that this report really is a continuation and follows on from our own findings. And as Lauren has aptly introduced me, I come from a municipal and cities level, particularly metros, from an organization that collates, analyzes research really to influence better urban practice. And if I were to grapple with the issue from a local governance perspective, Lauren made mention of some of the work that I do in putting out the state of urban safety reports that are annual, and that do find that what we advocate and what we always say as evidenced by our findings is that, of course, crime and violence are not benign. They have spatial, they have economic, and they also have social drivers. And I think it aligns then with the Xenophobic report, which then articulates how exactly all of that plays out in space. And what we call urbanization factors or migration factors are some of the key drivers of crime and violence in certain cities that are receivers of in-migration. And fortunately or unfortunately, our own reporting does not make the distinction between internal and cross-border migration, but it does find and it does articulate that, the poor management of migration and rapid urbanization that it seems our cities are grappling are struggling to grapple with and get a handle on are some of the drivers of crime and violence. That would be true for cities like Johannesburg, which, as we know, are big receivers of in-migration, while the drivers of crime and violence in other cities might be different. For the city of Johannesburg in particular, rapid urbanization and what we call migration factors are some of the key drivers of crime and violence. And so how that manifests at the localized level, at the community level, is a lot of poor and desperate urban residents kind of fighting it out for very limited resources and very limited opportunities, particularly in the context of contracted, significantly constrained and contracted urban economies. And so, Lauren, you make mention of, space being a critical factor in how violence, xenophobic violence manifests. And, you'll see that our different cities have, first of all, maybe to mention that, of course, the local level is the sphere of action. It's the level of government or sphere of government that is closest to communities. It's also the sphere of government that is the custodian of space. And so how local governments go about managing space and how they do that sometimes, can manifest or can come across as the institutionalization of xenophobia, as you'll see in some of the cities. You have operations like Operation Clean Sweep, and its new iterations. It always crops up time and again, where the operations of a city seem to target informal traders, and in a lot of cases, and in the case of a city like Johannesburg, informal trade equates to it's one of the few entryways that are available to the most desperate in our societies, and of course those without a regularized status in South Africa will find themselves engaging at that level of the economy in order to kind of make sure that they have a livelihood. And so when local governments target informal trade, by extension, it becomes, an intervention around that targets, sometimes and in many cases, foreign nationals and those who are most vulnerable in that their status in the country is not regularized and that they don't have entryways to regularize their stay in South Africa. And so that's also, that's a matter that you can look at two ways. It's a matter of the management of migration at the national level, which is a national competency, but how it plays out in space at the local level is through, these kinds of skirmishes that you then see. And so I think it's important to make the distinction that what you see in space at the local level, while it seems to target foreign nationals and equates to the institutionalization of xenophobia. On one hand, one can look at it as something that is explicitly and purely about consistent urban management. And so if you handle it as an issue of urban management, which is very critical and necessary, that needs to be happening on a consistent basis and not just in the form of, intermittent blitzes where police come in, they raid and they confiscate goods, but urban management that is needing to happen on a consistent basis, and which people within the communities are also kind of crying out for and needing. Even if the people in those communities are foreign nationals, they do have a need. And from a rights perspective, they do have a need for clean environments. They do have a need for environments that function. And so it's quite important to center this aspect that this is about urban management, which is not in a lot of urban cases and in the case of a lot of cities happening on a consistent basis. And so it brings to the center then what another factor that was mentioned of the role of civil society and the power that civil society has to hold accountable and to kind of engage and drive different spheres of government to live up to what their responsibilities are. To what extent could cities be putting in place and doing urban management in a way that is really true to the spirit of what urban management is about and bylaw enforcement. And it speaks to another point that was made about, violent entrepreneurship, where in the absence or where, the state and governance is weak, then you have, the emergence of different groups and different interests emerging and taking over that space where there is a vacuum. And I think in the context of urban management, you have the enforcement of bylaws done sometimes and in some cases in such a way that it's really not so much about enforcing bylaws because it's not consistent. It doesn't happen in the way that it's supposed to. And there doesn't seem to be a base principle in how bylaws are enforced, but it's also a way of the people who are operating those formal and formalistic systems to also kind of, create additional income for themselves. And so it's not enforcing a bylaw around building regulations for the sake of making sure that the law is followed. But, when you have a situation when then the persons who are supposed to be enforcing the law are in untoward relationships with some of the people, so bribery takes place, and so that kind of then disturbs the process of making sure that urban management happens consistently and in the way that it's supposed to. And so then bylaws, laws, regulations become weaponized. And another point that I wanted to make, just to close off my initial inputs around this, is that it's not what we see at the spatial and at the local level is not something new. It's just like the divided city, the segregated city, somehow finding a way to propagate itself into the future of our cities, because during apartheid and during the colonial era of our cities, you have what were called the move on laws that were created to kind of keep informal traders for situating themselves in city space. And so every 30 minutes you couldn't stand in one spot. Every 30 minutes you had to move. And so that created a situation where informal traders were trading from trolleys to make it easy for them to move. But those people were very much South Africans, but they were rendered as people who were antithetical to the city and people who didn't belong to the city by the standards of the government of that time. And so, who does and who doesn't belong has just merely changed the face and has just merely changed a nationality. And so how do we break that trajectory? How do we break that habit of the divided city and the segregated city constantly finding a way to propagate itself into our futures? So if we are enforcing urban management and the proper management in space, let that be that, and let's do that for the benefit of all who live in our cities. If we're going to be enforcing the law, enforcing bylaws, let's do that for the benefit of all who live in cities, in the spirit of creating cities that are inclusive and where everybody can reap the benefit of living. And I'm pretty sure that everybody is interested in a clean environment. Everybody is interested in a functioning environment where they can live, work, and play, and that's not a matter of nationality. However, I think it's very critical that at the national level, that urban management or migration management be happening in the way that it should be, and to be more efficient around the process of regularizing one's stay in South Africa. Not everyone who is here illegally wishes for that to be their situation. It's quite an expensive exercise to be illegal in a country, to not be able to have a bank account, to not be able to do the everyday things that make life possible. And so how do we not politicize and not create unnecessary red tape around people's ability to regularize their stay in South Africa? That's also part of the problem. It's not just a problem of, of course, loose and poorly managed borders, but it's also a problem in terms of the systems and how they are structured and how they enable or disable people to regularize their stay in the country. And of course, that manifests at the municipal level, at the spatial level, at the city level, in various ways that we see rendering the existence of many the most violent existences that you can imagine. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And welcome to, we've had a group that's come in recently. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Similarly, I think it's been very valuable in highlighting the degree to which building inclusive cities is critical, not just for immigrants, although that the approach to doing, that instead really cities are the front line for many people, for millions of South Africans who are trying to make a life. And we need to understand how this management at that ground level of those spaces is important, not just to addressing xenophobia, but to about making sure that people coming into cities are able to live securely and move up and fulfill their life goals and support their families. But we'll come back to you. I think there's already some questions. I have further questions for you, but I'd like to turn over to Mabuso and let you have a few minutes to speak, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion.
Thank you very much. My name is Mabuso Semang. Something that's not very popular to confess. I am a member of the ANC and have been since 1958. I want to correct a little thing here. Facts. I am not in any formal structure. I'm not a member of the NEC, and neither have I ever been. So that's who I am. I belong to an organization that actually championed the signing of the Freedom Charter. And the Freedom Charter is the foundation document for the Constitution of South Africa. And the Constitution of South Africa is actually one of the best constitutions in the world. So I'm proud of that association with people who were almost had non-racialism in their DNA. We acknowledge also that the achievement of freedom for South Africa is a product of the internal struggle of the people, but very much also the product of international solidarity. And a lot of that solidarity came in the form of sacrifices, particularly among African countries, among those who were in neighboring states, where people were killed in order for us to be free. We would have achieved this freedom. Might have taken much longer, but thanks to the help that we got from our fellow Africans, we achieved it at the time that we did. I did spend some time in exile, where I experienced also the welcoming and solidarity of other people across all continents, once they understood that I belonged to an organization that wanted to fight for justice. They were that happier to provide their support, which has just been amazing. There's been a strange, we South Africans, I think most of us are here. Once freedom was achieved, I think there was a period of fairly good governance, reasonably good governance. But what was missing right from the beginning was education, civic education about how we came to be, political education, that our people who were completely cut out of the international community, that is our people, South Africans, even white ones, just did not understand what was going on outside of this place. So some of the things that are happening today are a consequence of our neglect, I think in some instances unintended. But South Africans, even black ones, had a very strange superiority complex. Remember when I was there, I used to travel to Swaziland when the country was free. And some guys would come from South Africa and wonder how inferior Swaziland was, backward and all of that, because they had these roads and buildings that were built by other people to claim as home. So there's always been that superiority, perception of superiority over other people. It's a disguised form of inferiority in many respects, but that was never too harmful. Thabo Mbeki talked about we talk about denying that there is xenophobia. Yes, actually made a statement to the effect that, no, not xenophobic. We've lived with Malawians, we've lived with everybody here, and there was never any of those problems. It's an esoteric kind of argument, which is not terribly helpful in the face of what is going on here. So, with the decline in governance, particularly, well, by the ANC, because that's been the governing party from 1994, problems started cropping up. There were times the incidents of corruption started creeping in, and that led to the decline in popularity. You all know at your ages how until 2016, the ANC was untouchable, and how in Thabo Mbeki's administration, I think he achieved more than 2/3% of support in parliament. That really was a peak, and quite an achievement for a country as complex and sophisticated as South Africa. One-party states really don't exist in various in societies which is as complex as South Africa. So the decline in popularity was really mainly a consequence of corruption mainly by the governing party, my organization. And as people started to lose confidence, we started being very worried about competition from other parties. We now have not a very good multi-party system. It's multi-party, but with very weak opposition parties, which is really rather unfortunate for the country, because even at a time when things are not working as well as they should, and governance is bad, you cast abroad and across and wonder which party to join. And for many people, there aren't many parties to join in the absence of the ANC, or in what looks like it's an impending decline. So this denialism about corruption got really consolidated as in spite of glaring evidence. I mean, from 1994, actually, shortly, well, even before 1994, South Africans have been hostile to foreigners. They were called aliens in the past. Yes. And there has been incidents of people dying because of being killed by others. And as you point out, in many instances, in these incidents of violence, South Africans suffered even more. And more South Africans have been killed in many of these, during these peaks of violence. So we find ourselves today, and I must stop before we get too far, looking at what the cost has been to South Africa. It's enormous, and I wish we could have discussions with South Africans, with Africans, with other people, to really find a way, for the sake of South Africa as well, to get the country to back off from the line, the xenophobic line that is so prevalent. So bad are things that you find people in the ANC who really ought to know better, vying with the Dudulas of this world to try and jostle for popularity, and talk about jobs that must be quoted and all of that, which is of course complete nonsense when you realize that the people who are here, except for the people who are illegal, have every legitimate right to be here and every legitimate right to have jobs. We sign that up when we accede to things like the Geneva Convention and even more, the OAU Convention on Refugees. It goes further than the other things. So I think I would like to bring that to an end there. The consequences are actually tremendous. Investors don't like to invest in countries that are hostile, that are at war with each other, and that are corrupt. But also, you know, from Nigeria, which reacted quite strongly to some of the things that were happening in South Africa, how the MTNs, the DSTVs and so on, almost lost their business in countries because they're South African, and South Africans mistreat foreigners. We can understand why it's more than just xenophobia. It's mostly, shamefully, Afrophobia. That's where we are. So everybody needs this thing to be corrected, to be sorted out. I think we'll all live happily forever after if we can achieve that. It's not going to be easy. They really need to put our shoulders to the wheel and get this thing going. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have some questions coming in, but I want to just follow up on some of the questions about implications that you've raised in your different kind of interventions here. I mean, Jean-Pierre spoke about the kind of rise of a kind of gangster politics at the local level, and you know, and Sipilele, you already mentioned the kind of mismanagement of trading, for example, or bylaws, and you know, police spending their time targeting foreigners instead of targeting criminals, often conflating the two in the public administration. Mavhuso, you spoke a little bit about the implications of politicians, or you hinted at the implications of politicians sort of jumping on a anti-immigrant bandwagon, and amidst, you know, a time when we need real solutions to what are very real problems, and people turning towards towards immigrants or to anti-immigrant rhetoric, to fighting with the kind of populist street level politics to win support. What are the implications of these actions, of these configurations, of these tendencies for the state of sort of governance, of democracy, of participation, of an ability to create a kind of politics that is as inclusive and as democratic as we'd like it to be? So why don't I just, in this case, and then I'm going to ask you a follow-up question about what should be done. You know, if we could just go quickly in JP, and if you don't feel like you have anything to say, that's fine too. But maybe we could start with Jean-Pierre, and we'll go to Sipilele and Mavhuso as well.
Thanks. I think I can say a quick word around the implications for, I talked about creation for governance and rule of law, but also now for economic prosperity at national, but also at community level. At the national level, when you look at movements like the truck driver movements, when they block the roads because somebody has hired a foreign truck driver, it paralyzes the country's economy. We have seen how many people who are able to calculate the losses can say that's definitely something that shows that the consequences go beyond that when truck driver was hired by a company at local level. At national but also local level, we usually talk about migration triple win. When people, migrants, meaning domestic and international migrants, should be able to contribute to the socioeconomic development of themselves, their host communities, but also their communities of origin. That's what is known as migration triple win. But that does not happen when the host society is not welcoming. For a number of reasons, focusing now on the host society, at least from the research we do, we see that migrants are making a living, are able, despite all the problems, they are able in some ways to make money. But they cannot invest back in the communities because they're not sure about their future. They're not sure about their tomorrow. So there is what is seen as a constant resource outflow. Because of what I earn here, I cannot invest it back. I'm here, but investing somewhere else. Contributing development of other neighborhoods, other countries, other societies, instead of where I am, which could be much easier if it was possible. So discrimination has serious impact on the potential migration it can make in terms of socioeconomic development of host communities, but also communities of origin as well. I stop here for now.
Thank you. Just on the discussion of implications, of course, there are implications for the geopolitics of Africa, for the political economy of the continent. And wherever there's instability, xenophobia is one such form of that could indicate the instability of South Africa as an investment destination, similar to the unrest that you saw last year, where the clear and present threat was that a lot of the investors and those who are invested in South Africa as one of the key entryways to the continent were beginning to second guess whether they should continue to regard South Africa as such. They're beginning to look at other avenues within the continent and within the region from which they could operate. And those have a very, present implications for livelihoods within communities. So say, for example, if an automaker were to leave the port province of KZN, and the big ports that you have there, it would have great implications not only for South Africa but for regional economies as well. And I think that's just at the level of, I don't know then if it means that is South Africa saying that it wants to roll back what it has, the personality that it has engendered since 1994. A global stage as a global player. What does it mean for South Africa that had, been very open to being part of the global community once again? What does it mean for Pan-African solidarities and the rolling back of those kinds of solidarities? And what does it mean for the conceptions of our own pieces of policy legislation that kind of speak to who we are as a country? Ubaba Simang spoke to, the Freedom Charter. There's also the equality legislation that says non-discrimination by whether by nationality, place of birth, gender. It's quite broad in who it says South Africa belongs to all who live in it. And so what does it mean for who we say we are as expressed in some of our pieces of policy? And I think also there are also implications at the local level. So, again, I'm coming from the municipal and city perspective, and we talk about regional trade, but what about local trade? Those who do the research can give you, in terms of rands and cents, the big contribution that informal trade makes to urban economies and to the national economy. And I think more critical to economies, to food security. because, you know, street traders are a lifeline for so many of our households. And, you know, when you think about materially what it means for South Africa to be one of the most unequal countries in the world, and when you dial that back to, you know, very simple things and everyday needs, such as food security, informal trade is such a motto if you know, you so need. And for even South African households themselves, not just, you know, foreign nationals. And so those are some of the implications. And that's not to and who South Africa has framed itself as, and the personality that we engender relationships at regional level. As a region, we want, you know, SADC says that it aspires to not just a customs union, but a monetary union again. The free trade of goods, the free flow of goods and services throughout the region. What does it all mean when xenophobia is progressing the way that it is? Can South Africa continue to see itself and to engender itself as as both a global player and a regional player and leader?
Thanks very much. I know one of my colleagues has worked on just sort of the fashion industry in Johannesburg and the amount of estimates of billions of rands worth of trade just in one city, largely immigrant run, but involving South Africans, of course, sending trade throughout the region. And you think about shutting that down and just the consequences of one small sector. Well, it's not a small sector, but what that would mean for so many. May I turn it over to you, sir?
Yeah, I like what you said about not looking at things with rose-tinted glasses. As a 21st century nation, we really have to be governed by knowledge, information, research. Our actions must be based on that. We can't always do away with our sentiments, but really governance must be based on good research. Now, there are studies, if you allow me, I'm sure some of you have seen these things, research that was carried out, there's lots of it, but I just chose one quickly, which says immigrants contribute considerably to South Africa's economy. In contrast to popular perception, immigration is not associated with a reduction of the employment rates of the native-born population in South Africa. And some group of immigrants are likely to increase employment opportunities for the native-born. In part due to the high employment rate of the immigrant population itself, immigrants also raise the income per capita in South Africa. In addition, immigrants have a positive impact on government's fiscal balance mostly because they tend to pay more in taxes. Policies focused on immigrant integration and fighting discrimination would further enhance the economic contribution of immigrants in South Africa. How immigrants contribute to South Africa's economy is the result of a study that was carried out by the OECD Development Center and the International Labour Organization. These really are international respected institutions with support from the EU. The project aimed to analyze several economic impacts on the labor market, economic growth, and public finance of immigration in 10 partner countries, and they include South Africa. If we disagree with this, we would have to carry out our own research and say this is not true. I fully understand when unemployment is so high in South Africa, and you see, say, people from Zimbabwe, people who don't seem to be South African, having jobs in, what do you call it, in the tourism sector, restaurants and so on. It's like I feel bad. I see too many people from Natal having jobs in Gauteng. These things have a way of, but yeah, these colonial boundaries of ours. But let's be realistic. South Africa is South Africa with its own problems, and it must look after the interests of its own people. But the basis is wrong. I understand the person in the street feeling like that. I do not. When it is government, when the government must respond to these challenges in a scientific manner. And there is plenty of evidence that if the issue of migration, and if you like, even refugees, can be studied, and if the government took appropriate measures, they would actually be able to quell the emotions that we have as a population. So I'm not going to trivialize and say, but you're talking because you have a job. There is research carried out. I mean, there's many studies, and one as recent as 2021, which really confirm, and we would need to have more time to explain how it is that migrants, even at the lower levels of employment, for instance, tend to be more likely to start small businesses than we. And that by starting those small businesses, there is a benefit to local people and so on. I just really think my address would be to our leaders to really lead the nation properly and to assist people who are really embattled. The unemployment rate is very high, there's no doubt about that. And it's, one understands the feeling, but it is not based on facts, it's not founded, it's not well founded and so on. I think here in South Africa, we also have a lot of people who are undocumented. And it's really very risky to have people like that, because where they do commit crimes, where they do, and they do, you're unable to track them down. No fingerprints are captured in any of these things. So these are the realities that we have to deal with. But why are we having so many undocumented people? It stands to a very large extent to corruption. How would anybody get a house without an ID? Unless somebody was corrupt, accepted money and gave them that. If you wanted to travel to the Beitbridge from here, I think these guys who go back home in Zimbabwe carry some 700 rand. And this is meant to give 100 rand to each one of the people who try to stop them on the way to police. It is a given, it is a fact. I work for Home Affairs. I know also how the people there will take money and put a stamp and so on. So there is a bigger issue that we have to deal with if we want to deal with undocumented immigrants. And so I'm just saying, let's be open-minded in order to be able to solve the problem for our sake. So the last point I wanted to make here is what you touched on. You know, South Africa is really not just a regional power, but a continental power in terms of its economy, technology, communication systems, etc., etc. But if you look at the role we are playing in African institutions, we are punching far, far below our weight because people know us as xenophobic. We don't like Africans and so on. And they don't take us very seriously if they can help it. When Thabo Mbeki was president, I know from ambassadors who used to be posted to countries in Africa. When the ANC took a position on the permanent seat, at the United Nations, that would always be consulted. So any position that would be taken by South Africa that reflected African thinking, it was indeed. Big regional organizations, whether it's SADC, whether they're in West Africa, I'm forgetting now, I'm getting old, but there would always be South Africa was always consulted because we started on the right foot. And we are not consulted now. People come back and they are just looked at as some funny creatures who come from South Africa, which doesn't like other Africans, even as they are themselves in Africa. So it's really to say, even if you were doing it for your sake, rather than the people that we kick around, we would have to really go back to the not just basics, sit down and see how to solve what has become a problem, and it is a problem. Countries across the world, the United States, Trump said he was going to build a big wall in the southern part of the country and get Mexicans to finance it. He left office before he could even started. Thailand has similar problems with people because it's more developed. People tend to go to places where there's development. Just to dream, we are facing an energy problem now, South Africa, elsewhere. We have something called the Inga Dam in DRC. It can generate hydroelectric power, the biggest, more than what China has on those Yangtze rivers. We could give DRC $2 billion every year to allow that little air project area to be African, and we would get the cheapest electricity throughout sub-Saharan Africa, throughout. So this is just trying to say, let's think even more broadly. This is not just South Africa. Why are Africans so unimaginative? Why are we allowing Belgians to go and really make a mess of exploiting people in the resources there? So there is a bigger African challenge. I sneak it into this discussion because this discussion, the immigration that we're talking about, the xenophobia that we're talking about, is affecting Africans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. we have about 10 minutes left, which is not much time for the depth of the kind of discussion and themes that you've raised. And I know that some of our panelists will need to run, but I have some questions that have been coming in from various people online, and I'll pose you some of those at the end. But what I'd like to see is, does anyone here would like to raise a question or a point? We could take a few. I'll add to it from the online contributions and then give our speakers a last chance to respond before we wrap up for the day. Please just also introduce yourselves.
So, good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Pedro. I'm a visiting researcher at ACMS. I'm Brazilian. And I guess my question might be a little bit challenging, but that's the objective. Like, throw you a challenge because I was thinking about my country and what's been going on with Bolsonaro government and all the influx of refugees that we have been receiving since 2020, especially, mainly from Congo and Venezuela. For the first time, on the newspaper, at least, we have been seeing xenophobia in Brazil. It's something very new for the country. It's a country that we barely have undocumented people. It's difficult to be undocumented, and because getting a paper is very easy in Brazil and getting a refugee status is very easy. But we had a horrible case of murder of a refugee from Congo in Rio de Janeiro last April. His name was Moise, and he was working at the beach, and he came back to get his
those that engage in xenophobic violence. Also, in your research, have you been able to find out if any of the people caught engaging in xenophobic violence, in destruction of people's properties, businesses, have been prosecuted for that act?
All right. Thank you very much, Joyce. I've been reading. Okay, sir.
Quick one. My name is Joseph Eliapsan, and I'm from civil society, from African Unite and SAMIN, which is a Southern African Migration Network. And I read really through the report. Thank you so much for this. And I saw where civil society are concerned, and I agree with you. But it seems that where you say that our action are not coordinated, but also we have failed to convince government. And I think it's true, but it seems it's like a concerted effort by either some people in the government working maybe with courts. Because if I give you an example, the issue of opening the refugee reception in Cape Town has been there for almost 4 years. The High Court has said, please open, but Home Affairs has refused. And what do you do that? We NGO tried the litigation, they tried everything, but it seems some way there are people who are there to make sure that migrants or refugees are really not assisted. And affairs for refugees, they always come up with issues. So yeah, that was a quick comment, but really I agree with most of your findings where you spoke about deficit in the governance, but I feel maybe you failed to point to the governing party. Maybe it may be because of diplomatic ways, but really if the governing party, and I'm so sorry for Tate Msimang, because he's one of the people we still have who are really doing well in the ANC. But I think if they can be serious with this issue, many things can change. Otherwise, really the consequence, as Tate Msimang said, there are a lot. When you travel outside of South Africa, the first question they ask, why are you killing people? Last month, one of my cousins was supposed to bring 50 people here for his birthday. He canceled because he said, well, some are not getting visa. Others say, oh, South Africa is not the right country. So really, thank you so much for this piece. Well done.
All right, thank you. I'm going to turn it back to each of the speakers and try to summarize a few questions that have also come in online. I don't know if you've been following them, but really with and infusing with the question of my own, which is if the implications are this great and potential for South Africans, for its transformation, for its politics, for its regional representation, its diplomacy, we've heard a lot of different, for its safety. What needs to happen to bring people online? Is it that people have seen this issue and are choosing not to address it because there are other things? Or is there a need to bring other allies, other sorts of kind of have different kinds of conversations so people can understand the seriousness and hopefully, as you say, get government or others to address it more effectively. So I'm going to just leave it there. I'll come back just with a few thanks at the end, but why break with tradition? Let's go jump here if you have a couple minutes and see if
All right, so quickly, your question, Joyce. Yes, xenophobic violence is a crime. It's a hate crime. And although xenophobia is not a known category in South African police force as a crime category in the force, but generally, I mean, xenophobic violence is assault, is killing, is murder, whether it's a category in its own, but it's definitely a crime whose perpetrators must be held accountable. But the issue, as I said in my remarks earlier, the impunity has been one of the characteristics of the state response to xenophobic violence. Perpetrators of the violence, and by the perpetrators, I mean in two categories. There are those we see looting or doing things, taking things from the shops. Sometimes you see school kids going to shop when it's open and taking things. Those are usually the ones that get arrested and released like after a few hours, a few days on with the warning. But for us, the perpetrators are the instigators, people who sit, plan, organize the violence. And as we all know, collective violence requires organization. It requires mobilization, and somebody is behind it. We haven't seen violence followed by a thorough investigation where those behind it are held accountable. And for us, we see impunity as one of the reasons violence continues. Xenophobic violence, xenophobic discrimination has a clear socioeconomic benefits. And those organizing it apply what is known as rational choice theory, like you weigh cost and benefits. And when the benefits outweigh the cost, I don't understand why I can't do it. But I think going to Lauren's question, what can be done? I think the starting point is to reverse the scale. Starting to start to make sure that the cost outweigh benefits. In terms of accountability, you do this, you're gonna be held accountable. May not be enough, but could be a starting point. So yeah, it's a crime, and you have seen in many ways, you have areas that have become scenes of repeated violence with the same groups, with the same organization organizing, but no one has been held accountable. And that's why some commentators call the state complicit in this violence, because accountability and impunity is very hard to see for everyone. My colleague, in terms of the state, and we didn't have the chance to discuss how the other forms of manifestations of xenophobia. The violence is only one among many forms of xenophobia. Institutional xenophobia is another form of manifestation. And that sometimes includes denying outsiders services they are legally entitled to. For instance, documents, or services at the clinic, or at a store. Sometimes we get situations where you actually go somewhere, somebody looks at you and says, look, I'm not gonna save you. I know you might have rights or legal entitlement, but I'm not gonna. So it's one of the many forms of manifestation of xenophobia. And if we want to address the issue, it has to be approached at all different fronts. It cannot just be the violence on its own. I want just quickly to touch on one thing Ms. Mange said around illegality, around competition for resources and jobs. From my point of view, I see all these as also a governance matter. If the labor laws were enforced properly, we will be having this issue of exploitation. Everybody will be hired, married or not married, but there will be no areas where migrants are hired because they're going to be exploited. Or they're going to be given 10 rand when everybody is paid 20 or 100 rand. Same with migrants and undocumented migrants living in the country. The country has immigration laws. They may not always be to enforce, but when there is a perception that there's no even an effort by the state to enforce those laws, that's when we see communities, members of society saying, the state is not doing anything for us, we have to do something for ourselves. The same applies when we see mob justice. It's not just people like burning others on the streets. It's usually because of frustration that there is no response by law enforcement. There's no trust in law enforcement. And then people, of course, there are some doing it for their own benefits, but also we have to understand that that's the system and how the system is working to resolve problems and building that trust. Without it, I mean, somebody has called xenophobia, xenophobic violence as one of the ways community get involved in migration management, in a way, because the state is nowhere to be seen, at least not being seen as doing something to resolve the issues perceived to be related to migration. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. Sibylle.
Okay, I'll try to respond to the question around, so there was one around the closure of refugee registration offices. I think that's just one of the ways that relate to what I spoke about earlier, which is around how migration management is weaponized. And you know, then going up, setting about violating some of the rights that everyone is entitled to. South Africa is signatory to the Geneva Convention and a range of other instruments that guarantee the rights of refugee and asylum seekers. And when you start to frustrate the process of regularizing your stay in the country, that's just one of the ways that manifest in xenophobic violence then at the community level. Not everything, though, is, you know, doom and gloom. There is a lot about South African migration policy that is permissive and enabling. And I guess it has its own problems. So, for example, South Africa is one of very few countries, if not the only country, that has a non-internment policy for refugees and asylum seekers, meaning that while in a lot of countries, refugees and asylum seekers are are confined to specific locations and camps. In South Africa, refugees and asylum seekers have the freedom to find residence and to move and to be wherever they would like to be. That is one of the great values of our migration policy. However, it does have its own drawbacks in that when you don't facilitate and enable the integration of those persons in communities, they can then become vulnerable to violence, which we've seen in some communities where violence targets people of specific national identities. And so there's a need to tighten up how we facilitate that integration, because it's also about culture, it's also about cultural and social integration as well. We may enable people to live wherever they want, but there's also a need for us to kind of be more intentional about how those people integrate into the communities. And Jean-Pierre speaks to, tightening up on accountabilities. And I think that's something that applies to every facet of life in South Africa. And of course, it has manifestations when it comes to xenophobic violence as well. But I think communities are just so despondent, and they've seen so much where there's just no accountability for anything. Things happen, crimes are committed, and there's no follow-up, and there's no seemingly any tight process of making sure that there's follow-up and that there are consequences for certain things that are done. And of course, that is also going to manifest itself in the area of migration management and xenophobic violence that we see happening in communities. So to Lauren's question about if the implications are this far-reaching for continental solidarities, for South Africa's position as a regional leader, for trade, what should be done? And I think it goes back to the question of inequality, in that in South Africa, we are in a very dangerous and precarious position where not everybody is or can buy into our social compact. Not everybody has an investment in our economy. Not everybody has a role in our economy. They are unaffected almost completely by our economic developments, whether we have economic development, whether we have growth. If they have no jobs, if they have no food, if they have none of the basic needs, then they have no investment whatsoever in terms of what happens. And so that is one of the fundamental things that needs to change about our society. It's a very dangerous precedent that you have in South Africa, where a large majority just have no input, no interest, and no investment whatsoever to all the things that we hold dear. And so what do? You need to drive a really robust program around inclusion, social inclusion, economic inclusion, and inclusion in various other facets of life, because that is exactly what is the ticking time bomb. I would say, if I were to answer very quickly in a snapshot the question of what are we supposed to do, is that you're supposed to drive up the investment of more and more of us in our societies. And so when you have a situation of such deeply embedded exclusion and inequality, you create a situation where nobody cares about your economy, nobody cares about what you have, because they don't have anything. They don't play a part in it whatsoever. I would say that would be my one thing. Thank you.
Yeah. I thank you very much. I think the questions have been answered. I just wanted to conclude by saying what VETS is doing to get these issues discussed is one of the ways. How do we solve the problem? I think that's the question. For how long shall we be talking about these things, and what's to be done? There is really no silver bullet here. There is no easy answer, but it's good what's happening here. You wish it could happen in many other forums. It would be good to approach the ANC is in power until it loses it. It is in power. It really would be good. There is something called the Oliver Tambo School. It may be good to be happy to facilitate discussions with some people. They hold lectures, discussions every so often. I think this topic needs to be introduced there. But also, one other really good thing we have is that the media is still very free. I think people must just go out and write. They must, social media, those things must be flooded with this kind of question, but also the regular newspapers, the radios in particular. A lot of people listen to radio. And the media, I think just it must be discussed. It must be brought to the faces of people that we have this issue here. It'd be good for Africa one day to be a united continent. And we owe it to ourselves to build that. And it's your responsibility, you guys, as younger people, to really fight this thing out. It's going public about it, discussing it, and spreading the word. Not easy, but I don't have a better way to suggest how it should be taken forward. Thank you very much.
All right. Let me wrap things up, not with a long speech, but really just with a few thanks. Of course, to the panelists, Jean-Pierre Sipilele Mabuso, for their time. I know I've kept you a little bit long. We started a little late, but we're ending now. Behind the scenes, Silindile, Kuda, Karabo, and Lenore, who have organized everything, got things done, got these beautiful documents printed, to the supporters of XenoWatch, and of course to Wits University, who have also made it possible for us to have, I think, some snacks and some drinks, who are outside the door. For those of you who don't have to run, please join us out there, and please join me in thanking our panelists and everyone for the discussion. This is, as I said at the beginning, part of its mission to continue conversations, sometimes difficult, awkward, intractable conversations where there's no easy solution. And I appreciate all of you being part of that conversation this afternoon. So, and thanks to all those who joined us online. Sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but we're very pleased that you are also part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.